Hello. So this is the video lecture to replace the lecture that I missed because I lost my voice in week 5, and the topic is journalism research skills. Now, this lecture is going to go through some really basic journalism research skills because some of you have not done journalism before the subject, and some of you are just starting journalism. But I think it's always really good to just go back to basics. Hopefully, this lecture will help you do your research for your story idea, for your photo essay. And research is something that you just have to be really good at, no matter what you end up doing, obviously. But in journalism, what research is really good at is it will just give your story the depth, the nuances, but also just to make sure that you've got the angle of the story right, or that you are clear about what is it that you are doing with your story, what is it that you're actually trying to tell. All right. So, okay, things that I will cover. What is research in journalism, and how is it different to general research, digital research, non-digital research, writing a research brief, and the importance of having an ideas bank. Basically, my argument about research is this. It is crucial. All right, it gives your story depth, nuances when you're producing. It gives your story the wide and dynamic range to help you pace your writing and find your voice when you're editing. Now, if you have done your research and you know your story well, what I mean by the wide and dynamic range is that it just gives you the ability to go wide and go narrow when you need to. So, for example, if you're writing a story about there's a story today for Donald Trump is talking about how U.S. and Russia relationship, it's probably at its all-time low. If you're doing a story about a Russian living somewhere in in the US somewhere, for example, then if you know the history, if you know not only about this person, not only about the history of this person, but also the history of Russian migrations to Russian migration to the US, for example, and if you know just a bit of the history of the relationship between between the US and Russia, for example, when you are actually writing after you've done your research, it just gives you that ability to just go, I'm going to write something about this person, I'm going to take photos of this person, but when I'm taking photos, I know that there's this wide context. I know that there's all this knowledge in my head, and I'm going to sort of tell the story about all this stuff using this one photo, and it just gives you the confidence, the ability to create variety in your writing and in your photo taking. All right. It gives you story ideas when you don't have any. I'll talk a little bit about developing a story bank. It allows you to see your story in the wider context and to find the people you should be fighting and people you should be fighting for. So what I mean by that is that sometimes you look at a story and you go, okay, this story is a conflict between A versus B, but then you go in there, you find you do your research and you find that you're actually doing it the other way around. You should be doing it the other way around. For example, that the victims here are B instead of A. And I mean, the world is never black and white, right? So it's never, good versus, it's never good people versus bad people. It's always complex. There's always gray areas, and research will just give you the tool to navigate your way through the complexity of the world. And it gives you, as a professional, the knowledge and credibility to do what you do and be trusted by your audience. And of course, this is very, very important, especially if you are a journalist. What is research? Generally, research is a collection, organization, and analysis of information. Now, when we talk about journalism, there's something more specific that we need to be aware of. That journalism is impartial, collection, organization, and analysis of facts for the intent of providing the most pertinent information to a particular audience. Never forget your audience. All right, who are you writing for? Why are you writing what you're writing? If you remember what your audience are interested in, then they'll help you to find out what is what should be the angle of your story. So for example, for City Journal, if you're writing for the RMIT City Journal, then you're always thinking about, okay, who's my audience? My audience are people who live and work in the city of Melbourne. And so, for example, if you're doing the story about US Russia relationship, then you probably have to think about, okay, what is it about this story that is the most relevant for people who live and work in the city of Melbourne? With your photo essay, you have, well, the audience is basically your tutor and me, but also yourself, yeah, and other students who are studying at RMIT, who are doing photojournalism. We are going to be publishing some, most of your photos will be published in a special website, but the audience will be basically the same as City Journal, so it will be people who live and work in the city of Melbourne. So just really think about that. What will be interesting for them? What will people who live and work in Melbourne will find interesting about your story? Analysis of facts. Now, one thing that as a journalist you have to be aware of is that facts are never facts are never simple. Facts are always a part of a complex web of information, and there are various ways to produce, curate, interpret facts. And even when you have machines interpreting data, and this has been used by journalism recently, the algorithm or the software were designed by the people who are always a part of a complex web of things. So there's never just pure facts. Facts are produced by humans. So what do we do with that? Well, a good journalist firstly establishes the facts. So look at, okay, what are the facts? What are the facts that people have accepted? And then you verify the facts by analyzing and cross-checking the sources of the facts. So with this first part here, what I mean by that is you list the facts. And this is the exercise that we did in class last week. You write 5 of the most interesting facts about your story. And then the next part is look at that fact and go, okay, where is this fact coming from? Who produced this fact? Can I trust this fact? Can I cross-check it with an expert, with another person, or can you check from another source and find that the fact is the same? Basically, as I said in the first week, journalism is basically a discipline of verification. You become very good at verifying things. You become very good at analyzing where facts come from, and who produced these facts, and whether you can trust this fact, and how you can cross-check this fact with other sources. To put it simply, with your photo story, if someone says to you that he is sick with he's sick with cancer, for example, the case of Belle Gibson should be a warning for you. And if you don't know who Belle Gibson is, you should find out about her. She's the writer, the Australian health writer, who published all the stories about how she defeated cancer using natural medicine, and turned out that she was lying. But the thing is, she was able to do this thing. She was able to talk to all these journalists, and until finally someone actually checked the facts behind her stories. And so that is a really hard thing to do. But sometimes if someone tells you that, I'm very sick and I have cancer, blah, 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 if you are writing a story about someone, a prominent person who says to you that, I'm very sick, then as a journalist, it's your job to actually check, do some research, find out more about that illness, and find out if they're actually telling the truth. And it's always a hard thing when it comes to people's health, but it's your responsibility. It's your responsibility to make sure that whatever you write whatever you publish has been checked, has been verified. Okay, so that's probably a hard example, but if you're doing a story that is not about health, or it's a story about science, for example, then if someone says to you, "Oh yeah, I'm a physicist and I have discovered this thing about something," and then of course, then you go, okay, check their name, check their papers, check with other physicists as well about what he claimed to say. So yeah, it's just all about verification. And if you need help with this, just let your tutor know, and they'll be able to help you with that. But again, the basic thing here is that you need to always verify every fact. And after a while, you become quite good at sort of, figuring out whether you need to check something again and again and again until you can really, really trust, until you can really publish these facts. But a good journalist, they're also storytellers. So they also select which facts are the most relevant for their particular audience and use that to form the main thrust of their story. So this is, this is one description of an angle. Some people say, when people ask you, what's your angle for this story? It's basically, what is it? What's the most interesting thing here that you can find, that the most relevant thing for your audience, and you use that as an entry point to your story. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Before I talk a little bit more about angles, so how much research should you do? Not too much, not too little. That's probably not that helpful, but it depends on time frame. And in professional newsrooms, it depends on how much money is being invested in that story. If you are a daily news reporter, then you probably just focus on researching the basic 5W and 1H, what, where, when, why, how, and who. With your photo essay, with your photo story, it's probably closer to a research that you would do for a feature story. All right. And that means as a feature story, you should have the 5W and 1H, the what, where, when, how, why, and who, but also the how, but with more depth, guided by your angle. What do I mean by guided by your angle? You don't want to do too much research. So for example, if you found something really interesting about the story and you go, okay, I'm going to write the story this way, I think because this is the most interesting way to write the story for my particular audience, then use that to guide your research. Don't get too distracted by other things. All right. And by now, you should already have decided on the angle of your story. Or if you haven't, you should start really thinking about what is the angle of your story, okay? Or what is the most interesting and relevant information. There will be the thrust, there will be the main focus that you want to tell in your story. Now, I'll give you an example. So this is an example from a photo story, a photo essay, a multimedia photo essay. Called Taking Back Detroit. All right, so how can good research help you tell a focus story? So this is an example I'm going to give you. So this is the story. Taking Back Detroit, Portraits of the Motor City by Wayne Lawrence. Here from the die-hard natives and upbeat newcomers who are reimagining Detroit, playing out their dreams, or reveling in the once neglected city's revival. So basically, this is the angle here. Right here from the die-hard natives and upbeat newcomers who are reimagining Detroit. So the journalist, or the journalists in this case, they walked around Detroit and they wanted to tell a story about Detroit, and they found that there is this story about Detroit is now reviving. And who are the people behind this revival of Detroit? They found that the people behind this revival are the newcomers, like this guy here, who owns 150 homes in Detroit, or 150 houses in Detroit, and some of the houses he bought for $500 only. And if you're curious about that, well, read this story. It's a really interesting story about Detroit, who that used to be a really, really important, rich city in the U.S., and now it's sort of died, and then now it's being revived. And the journalist basically found, the angle of my story, because there are so many ways you can talk about Detroit and the revival of Detroit. It could be the story of many, many things, but the journalist decided, okay, the angle is going to be, I'm going to focus on the newcomers and the old people who've been around there for a while. All right, so then you click on each story, and with this one is quite beautiful because you can hear their voices as well. Um, that's Amir Farouk, retired executive from Singapore. And basically, I can sort of almost see, or you can almost see, right, that each photo or each person, each subject was taken to help deliver this angle, the angle of there's all these new people and all these people who've been in Detroit for a while. And there's this really interesting story about how they see the revival of Detroit. So this is the angle of this particular story. Instead of choosing other things about the architects, about writers or whatever, people who are reviving Detroit, they go, no, I'm going to go a little bit wider and go. The angle would be the new people and the old people of Detroit reviving Detroit. All right, and if you go and look at this, in less than 5 decades, the once vibrant motor city lost more than half its population. I'll get you to read it in your own time. But basically, if you read this, this is probably close to what is called the 100-word treatment, which is basically the summary of the story. And I'll talk a little bit more about 100-word treatment quickly a little bit later on. But yeah, if you have time, just have a look at this and find other stories that you like and try to find what the angle is behind each story. All right, so back to the presentation. So even with this one, with these 3 photos, you can see that these 3 guys are selected because there's the newcomer. This is a guy who's been there for a very long time, and he's sort of in the middle, right? So when the journalist selected the subjects for the story, the journalist was helped by having a really clear angle about who to take photos of. Now, this is a story that was done by Drew Ambrose, who's a reporter for Al Jazeera, and he sent me his research brief for his story, and you can have a look at the story. It's not a photo essay, it's a feature documentary, but basically what I want you to see is that there is this part here. So there is he has a document. As he's writing his story, as he's doing research for his story, he has a document that helps him identify what he needs to write, what he needs to find out about. And the main thing that he wants to find out is this thing here. Why does New Zealand have one of the highest rates of incarceration in the developed world? All right, that's the main question for the story that he's doing. And it's a beautiful story. It's called Locked Up Warriors. And if you click here, you can find the story. So for your photo essay, try to have one question that you want to answer. All right, and you can do this with every story. Some stories might require a more complex question. Some stories require a very basic question. And with this one, it's quite beautiful because it's very basic. It's a really basic question. Why does New Zealand have one of the highest rates of incarceration in the developed world? And that developed his thinking because it is the angle of the story, and that developed his thinking. So he has key questions, and this is all in the research brief that he has. The key questions are: why are Maoris overrepresented in the system? How much does it cost per prisoner in New Zealand? How does it compare to other countries? And you can see even the grammar isn't perfect just because this is just him just writing research briefs, just going, okay, what are the quick questions of my story? And he stopped at 6 questions, and probably there were more questions, but basically you just write all the questions that you want to find answers for in your story, and then find 5 or 6 of the most interesting ones. If you're doing a really short story, then probably just want to answer 1 or 2 questions, or 3 at max. But if you have a little bit more time, like you do now with your photo essay, then develop more than just 3 questions. Develop 4 questions, 5 questions that you want to ask and find answers for. And this is going to inform not only your writing, the text part of your photo essay, but also the taking of your photos. All right. And this is what I mentioned before, the 100-word treatment. The 100-word treatment is, in my case, whenever I'm working on something just a little bit longer, like a feature story, or even just something that's, like a 2-minute radio report, I work on, like a 50-word treatment. This is a longer feature, so it's a 25-minute documentary. So he has a 100-word treatment, but a 100-word treatment is probably really good for you as well for your photo essay. Try to write. This is basically like a blurb, right? And most likely this will be the blurb for your story, the introduction to your story. All right. So just have a read and sort of see how this is something that can really help you write your story. And this is a live document. All right. So when you first write, um, when you start doing your research for your story, as you write, my advice would be to write your 100-word treatment just to see how you see the story develops. Okay? So just write it. Even what you know about the story is very little. And then as you develop more things, as you know more things, as you do research and you find out more things, the 100-word treatment might change. But this is a really good document. The 100 treatment is a good document for you, especially because you're dealing with other assessments, right? You're not just doing photojournalism. You have other things that you're doing. This 100-word treatment is a live document, but it's also something that you can print or you can write in your Evernote or whatever. And what you do is when you want to start working on your story again, you've done other assessments and you're now ready to go back to doing research for photojournalism. You just look at the 100-word treatment. This is the summary of what you've done so far, what you have found so far, and this is a guide to your writing and to your research. All right. So when you read this, you go, oh, okay, now I remember where I am with my story. All right, and this is very important for you, especially if you're thinking about a career in journalism, where often you have to work on longer stories at the same time as you're writing on shorter stories. So if you've been working on something, and some stories take years to develop. So if you have this 100-word treatment when you're back to writing this particular story, you just look at this and you know exactly what you need. What are the different types of research? Okay, so there's the digital research. When using search engines, use search operators. All right, there are many search operators, and the best way to learn them is just to use them. And just click on this link when you've got the slides and just read them. If you have never used search operators, try it one by one. Even Boolean operators like and or, and the quotation marks, I use them almost every time I am working on a story. Social media, they are very, very useful, but you need, if you are thinking about using social media to do research, to find people, you need to have a professional presence on social media. My advice is to have a professional page for you as a journalist, and it doesn't matter if you don't have many people following you. This is just so you have a professional presence that you can use when you do research, and then you can and you also and then you have your own personal Facebook profile. All right, but even with your personal Facebook profile, just make sure that it's that you look reliable and professional, or it's protected. Many journalists actually change their Facebook names. I don't. But I think it's a good idea to have professional and personal Facebook profiles. I do have my professional page as well as my personal page. Twitter is a very useful tool to find people to talk to or to find what people are talking about. So if you look at trending topics, you use the hashtags and you can really find about what is it that people are talking about, and it's a really good way for you to find issues that you can write about or you can take photos of. Just remember that the people you find there are not always representative of the things that you want to write about. So, for example, automatically only people who are sort of digitally adept are on Twitter, actively on Twitter. So just remember that. But it's a very useful thing. Speaking of photos, I remember when I was at the ABC and there was the bomb in Jakarta a few years ago, and I just went on Twitter and I searched for people who were around. So I used geolocation and I used some sort of smart way to find people on Twitter. And and I found 5 photos in 10 minutes of the actual bombing of people taking videos of the bomb exploding in Jakarta. So it's a really useful tool to have and to know how to find on Twitter, to find things on Twitter. Might not be very useful for your photo essay, but it's good to know. It's for future reference. LinkedIn is also very useful to find professional contacts and interviewees. And if you are writing about an organization, if you use the advanced search, you can find former employees, and former employees are good because they can talk about their organizations with that. Many of them can talk about their former organizations without fearing that they might lose their jobs. Facebook is good to find people, sources, and also to distribute your stories and to tell your friends about the stories you've been writing and working on. And each has a really specific way that you can use to find information. But I'm not going to go into too much details. But basically what you need to know as well is you need to keep your notes organized. All right. And as a journalist, this is very important because it doesn't only help you with your story writing, but also if people are trying to contradict what you have written, what you have published. And in the future, if someone tries to sue you, if you know how to keep your notes organized, you can use them in court, right? You can just tell people, look, this is what I wrote in 22nd of January 2015. This is what this person said, and this is the evidence. I've taken notes of all this. And if you don't have that, then you don't have evidence of things to back up your story with. Personally, I use Evernote, which I find quite useful, but also good old reporter's notebook, just a normal notebook with dates on top of each new note, so I can always look back. With non-digital research, many of you are first-year students. Use the library, RMIT library. Talk to them. They are really good at finding archive information and checking sources, and just generally help you with research problems. A phone call. All right. If you want to know about something, if you want to call someone, take photos of them, a phone call is just much, much, much harder to ignore than emails. All right. Cold calling, which is, calling someone you've never called before. It's not as hard as it feels. Once you get used to it, you sort of know that you'll be fine. Yeah. And this is a good tip for you as well. If when you're pitching a story to an editor, for example, it's much easier for an editor to say no to an email. They can just go, or they might even not reply to you. But if you call them, it's harder for them to say no. This is digital research, but more on academic research papers. When you read academic papers, just avoid the single study syndrome. You read this a lot in journalism, unfortunately, where people, say, there's this new research that shows this new superfood is going to fix everything. All diseases are going to go away. But basically, then you read the story, and it's basically just this one paper that is probably more of a finding from an experiment that hasn't been replicated. So always do the basic journalistic verification. All right, who did the research? Who funded the research? and what wider conversation does the paper belong to, because an academic paper is never just one thing. It always has something to do with a bigger sort of conversation that the academics are having with each other. And when reading academic papers, I have a bit of a trick for you. Read the abstract first, obviously. So if you've read the abstract and you think, well, this is going to be useful for my story, at least for background information, then what you do is, if you think a paper is going to be useful after you've read the abstract, you read the intro and the conclusion. All right, so the intro paragraphs and the conclusion parts. After that, if you think that you need to read more of the paper, if the intro and conclusion, if they haven't given you what you need, then you read the first sentence of each paragraph. All right, because academic papers, well-written academic papers, they're usually written very well in terms of, the first sentence is always the sort of the key sentence, the main idea of the key idea of the paragraph. So if you read the first sentence of each paragraph and you just skim through the paper, you usually get a good idea of what the paper is about. If after reading the first sentence of each paragraph and you still find that you need to read the whole thing, then you read the whole thing. All right. But usually after you read the abstract, intro, conclusion, it gives you a bit of an understanding of what the paper is. If it's relevant, read the first sentence of each paragraph, and then just read the paragraphs that you really, really think you need for your story. All right. And then you can call the researcher and, ask them about it and make it into a story. And this is probably going to be, maybe calling a researcher is not going to be too relevant for your photo story, for your photo essay, but just for the future, or if you just want to have a little bit more understanding about your story and you have some academic papers that you want to read, don't try to read the whole thing at first, because if you read the whole thing at first, it takes you, if you're not used to it, it takes you, an hour to read a whole paper, and then at the end you realize, oh, it's not really useful. So just make sure that you use your time well. Read the abstract, intro, conclusion, first sentence of each part. Just skim read. All right. Letters. I've used letters in the past to to approach people I want to interview, and it's always an impressive thing to do, especially if you're approaching someone who's a little bit older. But the main point here that I want you to understand is that you need to develop all these little skills, people skills, to win their trust. For example, if you're cold calling, you need to prepare an opening line that you can deliver confidently. So, for example, for me, hi, my name is Tito Ambio. I'm a journalist with City Journal, and I'm writing a story on taxidermy. Just wondering if you might have a few moments for a chat. And if you've practiced that line over and over again, it just gives you a smoother entry to phone calls. And yes, phone calls can be really, really hard to do. And if people say no, just think of some tactics. You can push just a little bit more. Don't push too much. But if they keep on saying no, I'm not available, I don't want to talk to you, then ask for another time, or ask, oh, do you have anyone you can recommend me to talk to right now about this topic? And if they say no again, then just say thank you, and thank you for your time, and goodbye. All right, so cut your losses quickly, find someone else to talk to. Now, when you do research, if you do research properly, you will find that you find just all these amazing things. I mean, this is one of the things that's amazing about being an academic or being a journalist, that you always find all these amazing new things to write about or to take photos of. Don't be distracted, all right? Otherwise, you'll never finish your photo story. If you are on an assignment, if you are doing a story and you found something interesting that's a little bit, that it's outside of your angle, and it's not useful for your current story, then write it down in a well-organized ideas bank. Basically, for me, it's just what is the idea, and then the source of the idea. So it can be, I'm doing a story about taxidermy, and the reason is because I've read this amazing I found this academic paper on taxidermy in Victoria, for example, and I'll just quickly copy that paper's title and copy it next to the story idea column. So I have two columns, one column the story idea, the next column is the source, and then just forget it. And then next time you're thinking about writing for something, or next time you need to pitch story ideas, you just go back to your ideas bank and you'll have all these stories that you can do. Finally, as a journalist or a photographer or a media producer or whatever, you will never stop doing research. All right, so just read, find connections, go to places you've never been, learn what people are worried about. So this is my challenge for you. If you have not understood what negative gearing is, all right, negative gearing, find out about it. Because in Australia, people are talking about this all the time now. And it's an empowering thing to be able to know what something like this is, that people are so worried about this, that people are talking about this, and just to be able to explain it to other people. That's what journalism is, finding complex things and find the best ways, the most interesting ways to convey that complex thing in an interesting way. So yeah, negative gearing. It was really fun when I found out what negative gearing actually is. It's because, especially with finance, economics, they have all these terms that sounds very complex, but they're actually quite simple once you actually sort of read about it. And then find ways to tell photo stories about them. How do you tell a photo story about negative gearing? I'm sure there are so many different ways. You just do some research and then you can find an angle to attack this story, and you use that angle, find people, take photos, publish, and then you'll always be known as, oh, that guy or that journalist who did that amazing story about negative gearing. Find your own way of researching, organizing information, relish finding new, interesting things about the world. Be curious and be awesome. All right, that's it. Thank you very much. And if you have questions, just let me know. But otherwise, good luck with your story. Good luck with researching for your story. And if you have questions, send me an email or your tutor an email. And enjoy your Easter break. All right.